Okay, thank you. If I just have 1 second to. Okay, my notes have disappeared, but I think I'm all right with that. That's fine. Welcome to Intellectual Output 3, everybody. My name is Jamie, and I'm responsible for compiling the work that we have done for this intellectual output. So the goal of Intellectual Output 3 is to develop, test, and disseminate language-neutral learning activities that help student engineers to learn about e-communication and to improve their skills in e-communication. The product at the end of the badge project, so in a couple of weeks, will be a guidebook, a catalogue of ideas that will inspire language teachers to improve their student engineers' communication skills, especially in terms of e-communication. Now, the Intellectual Output 3 is based on the GELS framework. For those of you that are new to the badge project, GELS stands for Global Engineers Language Skills, and it's a network of language and communication teachers that work specifically with student engineers in engineering departments or in technical universities. And back in 2015, we put together the GELS framework. Now, you don't need to be able to read this, but I really just want you to be able to see the shape of it. This GELS framework is already available at the Click website at the top of the page. So if this is something that you want to look at more in the very near future, then I'll direct you to that website. The GELS framework then is a framework of progressive communication skills designed especially for engineers. And I've presented this many times and I've talked many times about how we put this together. So I'm not going to go through that now. But what I want to make clear is that this complements the CEFR guide, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. So it takes learners from A1 and A2, from beginner's level, right through to C1, C2 advanced level. It covers 5 kind of skill areas: listening, reading, spoken interaction, production and writing. And like I said, it's specifically designed for engineers. So it's less about, for example, expressing opinions. That's something we find quite a lot in the CEFR. The GELS framework that's for engineers is not about expressing opinions. It's about expressing ideas, expressing understanding, commenting on data. So that's the idea of the GELS framework. So we had this already before the badge project, but what we did at the beginning of our project was to think about how we can adapt this for IO3 with our special focus on e-communication skills. So we really spent the first year doing a thorough needs analysis, interviewing teachers, interviewing students, interviewing engineers in industry, interviewing also other employees in engineering firms, for example, HR representatives, and asking them, okay, what are the most important e-communication skills? What do engineers need to be able to do? And how frequently do they need to be able to do this? And that needs analysis allowed us to adapt the GELS framework and include what we've called an e-communication layer. And what this is, we've really just added e-communication where we felt it was most appropriate to do so. I've highlighted, like I said, you don't need to be able to read this, but I just wanted to highlight various aspects of what I mean by an e-communication layer. Sometimes we're dealing with genre, for example, instant messaging. Sometimes we're dealing with context, for example, social media. And sometimes we're dealing with the real nuts and bolts of e-communication, for example, the words, the vocabulary that you need to be able to talk about something on your computer or to describe a problem that you're having that's related to e-communication. So this was the first stage of IO3, was making sure that the GELS framework really was useful for us in terms of thinking about what we mean by e-communication and what students need when it comes to e-communication, or student engineers, I should say, what student engineers need when it comes to e-communication. From the framework then, we developed the Io3 Guidebook. And what you see on the screen now is a structure for the guidebook. So it begins with a brief introduction to IO, which I've given you in this presentation already. And I'm also going to use this introduction as an opportunity to talk a little bit about how we've got to where we are today, because we spent a long time thinking about what we mean by e-communication. And our ideas of e-communication have been drastically altered in the last 2 or 3 years, as many of us have been forced to use a great deal of e-communication in our classrooms, sometimes for the first time. The guidebook will then present the GELS framework as I presented to you, and then we move on to one-page summaries of each level. And this is represented in figure 3 here. Again, you don't need to read it, it's just for the shape. This page then represents A1, so beginner level. And what you see in the grid is a list of very kind of succinctly written ideas that we hope will give teachers inspiration when teaching beginners in any language. And there's a grid to the right-hand side that makes clear what skills are tested in each idea. So it might be spoken production and writing and e-communication, for example. And the idea is that we hope that teachers will be able to very quickly find activities or ideas for activities that they can use with their students. Teachers will go to this and say, no, I want my students to practice writing for e-communication. What does this catalogue tell us? So figure 3 represents those one-page summary, and this is for A1. And then after each summary, there'll be a list of ideas for each skill at each level. So figure 4, again, something that you don't need to be able to read just to see the shape. Figure 4 represents A1 spoken production. And as with every skill at every level, what we have is a repetition of what is in the GELS framework, and then a breakdown of those statements. And then under each of those kind of parts, there are ideas that we hope will inspire teachers to put together a learning activity. So figure 4 there represents A1 spoken production. And then at the end of the guidebook, there'll be activity descriptions based on ideas. The second part of the IO3 was to gather as many activity descriptions as possible. We had a little competition to encourage teachers to put together activity descriptions. And I've produced 30 descriptions based on these that are not necessarily tied to a specific level, but that I hope will inspire teachers working with students at different proficiency levels. So that is the structure of the IO3 guidebook. And I'm now at the final stages of compiling this. I've received some very useful feedback from partners in the last week or so. So thank you very much to you. Thank you to Maria, for example. I can see you now. In the next few weeks, then I shall be putting together the final version of this guidebook. Now, I want to show you some examples from the guidebook, but before I do, I want to really just reference a very important inspiration in putting together this guidebook. And that is the kind of the dogma philosophy of teaching additional languages. This philosophy comes from quite a famous book called Teaching Unplugged, which really inspired me when I discovered this several years ago. The idea of the dogma method, if you like, or teaching unplugged, is that we as teachers should not slavishly follow a textbook or any kind of externally produced teaching material. But that instead we should work with what we have in the classroom. We should work with the students' interests, with their needs, with their emergent language, and keep it simple. And so this is the philosophy that I have tried to follow in putting together the IO3 guidebook. So now for some examples. So it's important to say that the Io3 guidebook is not a syllabus. It's not something that teachers should follow. It really is a catalogue of ideas that we hope will inspire teachers to put together activities that are relevant for student engineers. Here is an example from Swedish, from a beginner Swedish course. The idea in the Io3 guidebook, or one of the ideas for beginners, is that they should be able to read aloud letters and numbers. Okay, that's something that we do in a general English class. But why not? If you've got a group of student engineers, why not have them read out letters and numbers that are relevant for engineering? and specific to our case right now, e-communication also. So here's an activity where students work in pairs. They read out common acronyms used for e-communication, USB, MP3, and then they'll talk about what these mean. And all of these are English terms, so they'll need to use some English when it comes to working out what USB stands for. But then they switch back into Swedish when they then have to read these reader-friendly definitions of these e-communication terms. And the students also need to find some specific vocabulary, so keyboard or learning environment. So here is one of the activities based on an idea from the Io3 Guidebook. Here is another activity. This time we moved to Spanish and we moved to slightly more advanced students. This was an activity designed for A2 level students. Now, two ideas that come from the Io3 Guidebook are as follows. And the first one is being able to enter text. And the second idea is giving and receiving instructions. Now, I should add at this point that every needs analysis I've done when it comes to engineering communication, every needs analysis has come up with the following result, and that is engineers need to be able to give and follow instructions, both written instructions and spoken instructions. So there are a number of activities in the guidebook that work with instructions and allow students to then consider what makes an effective instruction, whether it's written or spoken. So here's an example of, this is still beginners, this is A2, but it's about giving instructions for entering text that is specific to Spanish or specific to engineering, specific to e-communication there with the arroba, the at sign. But really, this is an activity in Spanish. It's using the imperative form and giving simple instructions. So how to enter Spanish text or engineering related text in the Swedish computer. The final example that I'd like to share with you is for intermediate level students. One of the ideas in the Io3 Guidebook is that intermediate level students should be able to explore the differences in neutral and formal register, and to begin to understand what the characteristics of neutral writing and formal writing are. So this is an activity where students need to write 2 emails with the same content, but for 2 different audiences. And this activity actually was inspired by a number of comments that we received during the needs analysis at the beginning of the badge project, particularly from non-engineers, I have to say, but perhaps that's less important. But many commented that when it comes to e-communication, many engineers slip into rather chatty, informal language, which has led to inconsistencies and difficulties in the workplace. So the idea is that engineers need to be able to communicate effectively in a neutral register for in-house communication, for example, instant messaging or emailing. So that was really the inspiration for this exercise. And I tested this activity with my B1 level students last year. It was a real success. The most successful thing, I have to say, was having the students discuss afterwards what they did, what they actually did to make the neutral text reader friendly, and then what they changed to make the text more formal. And I felt that this was a very useful lesson for them that they'll carry on when it comes to writing emails in the future. So I've presented to you 3 specific examples that have already been inspired by the Io3 Guidebook. The Spanish example deals with the very first point that we see there, to instruct a partner to type letters or symbols. But in the page, you see other examples of activities for e-communication. I'll give you a moment just to look through some of those. So the way that I've written these in bullet point form, this is how they're presented in the grid. So that the teacher can find these very quickly. Then when it comes to descriptions, then there'll be a sentence or two added to some of these to provide a little more inspiration. And then some of these will find form at the end of the Io3 Guidebook, where there's an actual activity based on, for example, instructing a partner how to type letters and symbols. Okay. So I'm going to finish by asking and answering 3 important questions. I realize that when the framework and when the guidebook are presented in the way that I presented them today, in the way that I presented them in Poland several weeks ago, it can feel rather overwhelming, because what I'm producing really, it's the product of many years' work. So I want to go back to the beginning a little bit and ask 3 questions that I think many teachers ask themselves when they look at something like the GELS framework. The first question then is, why should I devote lesson time to specific purposes? And my answer is that LSP is context driven, first of all, which is a major advantage. LSP is based on applied research and on needs analysis rather than any kind of complex theory, which for me is a major advantage. I also think LSP is an excellent opportunity for language teachers and engineering teachers to collaborate genuinely and effectively. So there are 3 reasons why I think LSP is something that we should really take seriously and be inspired by when it comes to our own teaching. I should add that I don't think that we can teach LSP. I'm not attracted to the idea of teaching language for any specific purpose. I enjoy learning languages for their own, that there's a benefit in learning language in itself. But I do think that we should offer students opportunities to use what they are learning in interesting ways. And one interesting way is for a professional purpose. So I hope that answers any questions about why we should devote lesson time to LSP. A second question is to teachers who teach languages other than English. Should a German teacher, for example, really devote lesson time to discussing register in emails, the differences between neutral and formal register in emails, rather than dealing with German language and German speaking culture? I think that there's real importance in including LSP tasks in all language teaching and learning. And I think that we send a rather dangerous message, actually, by not including LSP tasks in languages other than English. That we leave the specific purpose just to English, I think, is a major mistake. I'm going to share with you an observation from Sweden, the country where I live and work. Those of you that have been to Sweden know that Swedes are very enthusiastic and confident speakers of English. If you visit Sweden, you'll know you don't need to learn Swedish to get by. And that is even the case if you're a graduate student coming to a university like mine. All of your education will be in English at master level and at PhD level. So there is a widely shared notion that internationals don't need to learn Swedish, especially when it comes to engineering. But I think that this actually indirectly contributes to a vicious circle. And this vicious circle, I can say, in Sweden has led to what I see as a diglossia on university campuses, where everyday conversation is in Swedish, but then as soon as things start to get technical or academic, then English is used more and more. And this is between native speakers of Swedish. More and more are having to use English in order to communicate their knowledge and understanding of engineering. And this has direct consequences on students, on their learning, and on people that visit university campuses. So that's one reason why I think LSP in all languages is relevant and it's important. And I think it's enriching anyway, even if it weren't important. So that's my answer to the second question. Yes, of course, we should be including LSP activities in languages other than English. The final question is about how much LSP we should be including in our classes. Now, this really depends on your class. It depends on the student's needs. But I've synthesized all of the literature that I found that answers this question, and I've put this together. Generally speaking, the recommendation is that the proportion of LSP should increase with a student's level of proficiency, so that at beginner level, roughly a quarter of the activities or the lesson time should be devoted to specific purposes, and that can increase anything up to 3/4 as we get up to C1 and C2 at advanced level. So I hope that answers the question of how much LSP. Now that brings me to the end of the presentation, and in a moment I'll welcome questions and comments. I just want to finish with a few useful sources. I'm often asked questions about engineering related vocabulary, and I've listed some useful sources there, and then also some sources that I have taken inspiration from in putting together this presentation. So I thank you very much for listening, and as I said, I welcome questions and comments.
Okay, thank you very much.